They wore the uniform, took an oath, and trained to protect. But behind the medals and salutes hid dark secrets. Crime so brutal, they shattered trust and left scars on history. These are the soldiers who crossed the line, trading honor for horror, and paid with a lifetime behind bars. Case number 10, Michael B. Henna, war crime or act of survival? Michael B. Henna was once a symbol of promise, a clean-cut, all-American soldier from Oklahoma, a West Point graduate and first lieutenant in the U.S. Army. B. Henna deployed to Iraq during one of the deadliest periods of the war. He was admired by his men, respected by his superiors, and loved back home. But in 2008, that all changed with one bullet, one body, and one decision that would define the rest of his life. B. Henna was part of the 101st Airborne Division, patrolling the violent Sunni Triangle, a region infested with insurgent activity. It was a place where allies turned enemies in seconds, where civilians and combatants were often indistinguishable, and where trust could be a death sentence. Tensions ran high, and the rules of engagement were constantly tested. On April 21st, 2008, a roadside bomb tore through a convoy under B. Henna's command. 2 of his men were killed in the blast. The insurgents responsible vanished into the shadows. Days later, intelligence led them to Ali Mansour, a suspected al-Qaeda operative believed to be linked to the attack. B. Henna's unit arrested Mansour, but a lack of solid evidence meant he had to be released. To the men who had just buried their friends, it felt like betrayal. Here's where the story takes a dark and irreversible turn. On May 16, 2008, instead of releasing Mansour as ordered, B. Henna and his interpreter took him out to a remote desert culvert under the pretense of returning him home. What followed was not captured on camera. There were no body cams, no eyewitnesses, just conflicting testimonies, a lifeless body and a career and life destroyed. According to B. Henna, he was conducting an impromptu interrogation. He claimed that Mansour lunged for his weapon during questioning, prompting him to shoot in self-defense. But forensic evidence painted a different picture. Mansour had been stripped naked, shot while seated, and left to die in a ditch. 1 bullet struck his chest. Another entered through the head. The Army didn't see an act of survival. They saw a calculated execution. B. Henna was arrested and charged with unpremeditated murder. His defense argued that he had acted under extreme emotional distress, that the battlefield trauma, the loss of his men, and the failure of the system to hold Mansour accountable had clouded his judgment. But the prosecution insisted it was a cold-blooded killing, an abuse of power that undermined everything the U.S. military stood for. The court-martial was swift and highly publicized. B. Henna was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. His rank was stripped, his uniform gone, his future erased. To many, he was a war criminal, but to others, he was a scapegoat. The case ignited a firestorm across the nation. Supporters argued that B. Henna was put in an impossible situation, that the complexities of modern warfare were incompatible with courtroom justice. They claimed he was abandoned by the same military that had trained him to make life-or-death decisions under unimaginable pressure. Petitions were launched. Political figures called for clemency. His parents became vocal advocates, traveling across the country to plead their son's case. And slowly, the tide began to turn. In 2014, after serving just 5 years, Michael B. Henna was released on parole. But the story didn't end there. 5 years later, in 2019, President Donald Trump issued a full pardon for B. Henna, completely wiping his record clean. It was one of the most controversial military pardons in recent history. Some hailed it as long overdue justice. Others condemned it as a dangerous precedent, one that blurred the line between combat and crime. Today, B. Henna lives as a free man. He's returned to Oklahoma, built a quiet life, and rarely speaks publicly about what happened. But the scars of that one decision, on him, on the victim's family, and on the military code of conduct, remain. Was it murder or a moment of war-fueled desperation? Justice or betrayal? The case of Michael B. Henna is not black and white. It lives in the murky gray between honor and horror, loyalty and law. And it reminds us, not all life sentences are served in prison. Some are carried in the mind for life. Case number 9, Lawrence Hutchins 3, the Hamdania murder. War turns boys into men and sometimes men into monsters. In the fog of battle, the lines between right and wrong can blur. But in the case of Marine Sergeant Lawrence Hutchins III, there was no fog thick enough to hide what happened in the Iraqi town of Hamdania in 2006. Hutchins wasn't a rookie. He was a leader of a Marine fire team, responsible for keeping his men alive in one of the deadliest war zones in Iraq. The area was crawling with insurgents, IEDs, and ambushes. Every day was a coin toss. Who would survive, who wouldn't? But for Hutchins, surviving wasn't enough. He wanted to send a message, one that would make the enemy think twice before striking again. And so, in the dead of night on April 26, 2006, Hutchins and 7 other Marines set out on a mission, one not ordered, not authorized, and not legal. They planned to kidnap and kill an insurgent. But when their target wasn't home, they settled for an innocent man instead. That man was Hashim Ibrahim Awad, a 52-year-old disabled Iraqi civilian, known in his village as a harmless, quiet man who walked with a limp. He was taken from his home bound and led to a hole near a roadside, where he was shot multiple times. Afterward, the Marines staged a scene to look like Awad had been planting an IED. They planted a rifle and a shovel next to his body. It was a lie, wrapped in camouflage and blood. But the lie didn't hold. Villagers knew Awad was an insurgent. They demanded answers. The incident drew scrutiny, and eventually, investigators discovered that something was terribly wrong. Witnesses came forward. The narrative began to unravel. The military launched a full investigation, and soon the men involved were arrested, one by one. What followed would become one of the most notorious war crimes committed by U.S. forces during the Iraq War. At the center of it all was Sergeant Lawrence Hutchins III, the squad leader, the one who had authorized, planned, and executed the mission. At his court-martial, the evidence was overwhelming. Testimonies from his own men implicated him as the mastermind. The prosecution portrayed him as a man who allowed rage and vengeance to override every military rule, every ethical standard, every ounce of humanity. Hutchins claimed he believed Awad was an insurgent. He insisted he was following what he thought were acceptable rules of engagement in a war zone where danger lurked behind every door. But the facts didn't back him up. Awad had no known connections to insurgents, no weapons, no bomb-making materials, no threat. In 2007, Hutchins was convicted of unpremeditated murder, conspiracy, and other charges. He was sentenced to 15 years in military prison. His career was over. His name would forever be associated with disgrace. But the case didn't end there. Hutchins' legal team fought back. They argued that his rights had been violated during interrogation, that he was held in solitary confinement without a lawyer for days and subjected to unlawful questioning. In 2010, the Navy Marine Corps Court of Criminal Appeals agreed. His conviction was overturned. But in a rare move, the ruling was reversed and Hutchins was retried. The legal back and forth dragged on for nearly a decade, becoming one of the most controversial and prolonged military legal battles of the Iraq War era. In 2015, after multiple appeals and retrials, Hutchins was ultimately released from prison, having served around 7 years. His sentence was reduced, but the stain on his record remained. He was given a bad conduct discharge, stripping him of all military benefits. To this day, Hutchins maintains that he was a scapegoat, that in the chaos of war, decisions were made under duress, and that others who share responsibility escaped harsher punishment. Some of his men received plea deals. Some served less time. Hutchins bore the brunt. To others, however, there's no gray area. A disabled man was taken from his home and executed. His life was worth something. And the uniform doesn't excuse murder. The Hamdania incident left a permanent scar, not just on people of that village, but on the image of the United States military abroad. It raised chilling questions about the mental state of troops under pressure, about command responsibility, and about how far soldiers might go when they feel abandoned, angry, and emboldened. The war in Iraq didn't just end lives overseas. It changed those who fought in it forever. And for Lawrence Hutchins III, the war may be over, but the sentence lives on in memory, shame, and controversy. This wasn't a battlefield casualty. It was a calculated act, one that betrayed the uniform and the values it stands for. Case number 8. John Bennett, the Forgotten Executioner. In the long history of U.S. military justice, only one man has been executed since the end of World War II. His name? Private John Arthur Bennett. Just 19 years old, Bennett's case is a haunting tale of youth violence and the harshest punishment imaginable, death by hanging. He wasn't a war hero or a high-ranking officer. He was a low-ranking Army private stationed overseas, far from home, caught in a storm of personal demons and institutional punishment. His crime was monstrous, but the debate around his death sentence still echoes decades later. Was it justice, or was he made an example? The year was 1954. The location? Austria, then occupied by U.S. forces following World War II. Private John Bennett, a young African-American soldier from Arkansas, had already been in trouble with the law. He had prior infractions, disorderly conduct, drunkenness, and insubordination. But what happened on January 2nd of that year shocked even his fellow soldiers. That night, Bennett wandered off base while intoxicated. He broke into a home in the small town of St. Margarethen and brutally raped and attempted to murder an 11-year-old Austrian girl. He left her beaten, bloodied, and unconscious in the snow. Miraculously, she survived, but barely. The military acted swiftly. Bennett was arrested, interrogated, and court-martialed. The trial moved quickly. The evidence was undeniable. His confession was detailed, and the girl, though traumatized, testified to the horrors she endured. In 1955, he was convicted of rape and attempted murder. His sentence, death by hanging. In most military cases, even when death is handed down, it's not carried out. Most are commuted to life imprisonment. And in Bennett's case, even President Dwight D. Eisenhower had the power to reduce the sentence. But he didn't, despite multiple appeals, despite protests from civil rights groups and pleas from Bennett's lawyers. The execution date held firm. Eisenhower personally reviewed the case and declined to intervene. Why? Because of the nature of the crime against a child and against a civilian in a foreign country. On April 13, 1961, at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, John Bennett was hanged. He was 26 years old. He remains the last U.S. soldier executed by the military and one of only a few executed by the armed forces in the 20th century. His case, while largely forgotten by the public, left an indelible mark on military law and policy. But why does Bennett's name still stir controversy? Because some saw and still see his case through the lens of race and justice. Bennett was black, poor, and uneducated. His victim was white. In 1950s America, and especially in the military justice system of that era, that fact alone shaped the trial. Civil rights activists argued that white soldiers convicted of similar or even worse crimes had their sentences reduced or were quietly discharged. Yet Bennett was hanged. Out of the 160 soldiers sentenced to death between 1942 and 1961, only one was executed, Bennett. And he wasn't a battlefield killer. He didn't commit treason. He committed a civilian crime during peacetime and paid the ultimate price for it. Even some involved in the case later expressed doubts. One of the jurors, years later, admitted he believed the sentence was too harsh, but felt pressure from commanders and the political climate of the time. Others saw the execution as a diplomatic gesture, a way for the U.S. to show Austria it would not tolerate atrocities from its occupying soldiers. Was Bennett a monster? To many, yes. What he did to that child was unspeakable. But was his punishment consistent with military precedent? That question has never had a satisfying answer. Today, John Bennett's story is rarely told in textbooks or documentaries. He doesn't have a grave with honors, no commemorative plaque, no legacy of redemption. He was erased from the Army's history quietly, an uncomfortable chapter many chose to forget. But justice, if it is to mean anything, must be examined through context, through history, and through its patterns. And in Bennett's case, the pattern is undeniable: his race status, and timing sealed his fate as much as the crime itself. The U.S. military hasn't executed another soldier since. Bennett's case ended capital punishment in the ranks, not because his crime was the worst, but because it showed just how flawed the system could be, how selective justice could become, How easily a single soldier, young, lost, and violent, could be turned into a symbol. He may not deserve sympathy, but he deserves to be remembered, not because he was innocent, but because he was a last. Case number 7. Brent Burke, from decorated soldier to life sentence. War leaves scars that aren't always visible. For many soldiers, the battlefield follows them home, bringing with it memories, trauma, and sometimes tragedy. The story of Brent Burke is a haunting example of a decorated soldier whose life spiraled out of control after his service, leading to a conviction that shocked his community and raised questions about the cost of war on those who fight it. Brent Burke enlisted in the U.S. Army in the early 2000s. He served with distinction, completing multiple combat tours in Iraq. His service record showed bravery and commitment under fire. Yet, behind the medals and commendations, something darker was brewing. During his deployments, Burke witnessed the brutal realities of war, explosions, ambushes, and the loss of comrades. These experiences took a toll on his mental health. Like many veterans, he struggled in silence, haunted by memories and the weight of responsibility. The Army diagnosed him with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, a condition all too common among combat veterans, yet often misunderstood or inadequately treated. When Burke returned home to Texas, reintegration into civilian life proved difficult. Friends and family noticed changes, mood swings, irritability, and withdrawal. Some said he seemed haunted by invisible battles. Unfortunately, the support systems designed to help veterans like Burke were either insufficient or inaccessible, leaving him vulnerable. The tipping point came in 2011. During a heated argument at his family home, tensions boiled over. Alcohol was reportedly involved, a common factor in many domestic conflicts involving veterans. The argument escalated rapidly, fueled by years of unresolved trauma and personal strife. In a tragic moment, Burke pulled out a firearm and shot a close family member, killing them. The act sent shockwaves through his community. How could a man who had survived the horrors of war end up committing such a violent crime at home? Burke was immediately arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The case quickly drew attention, highlighting the darker side of the veteran experience. At trial, prosecutors argued that Brent Burke's actions were a criminal act of violence, not justified by his military service or mental health claims. They painted a picture of a man who, despite his background, made a conscious decision to take a life in a moment of rage. The defense, however, brought a different perspective. They presented evidence of Burke's PTSD and other combat-related psychological conditions. Expert witnesses testified about how these disorders can impair judgment, increase aggression, and cause flashbacks or dissociative episodes. They argued that Burke's military trauma significantly contributed to the tragic event, and that his actions, while tragic, were not those of a cold-blooded killer, but of a man overwhelmed by the invisible wounds of war. Despite this, the jury found Brent Burke guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. The verdict underscored a painful truth. Military service and mental illness do not excuse criminal actions, but they do complicate the story of justice. Burke's case sparked intense debate about the responsibility society holds toward veterans, how to balance accountability with compassion for those struggling with war's aftermath. Veteran advocacy groups used the case to push for better mental health resources, more accessible counseling, and programs to help soldiers reintegrate successfully. They emphasized that without proper support, many veterans face a dangerous spiral that can lead to violence, self-destruction, or incarceration. Burke's family, friends, and fellow veterans have since described his downfall as a tragedy that could have been prevented. They emphasize the need for early intervention and better understanding of the challenges soldiers face. This case also revealed the limits of the military and civilian justice systems in addressing crimes involving mentally ill veterans. It raised difficult questions about punishment, rehabilitation, and the role of trauma in criminal behavior. Was Brent Burke a victim of war as much as he was a perpetrator of violence? How do we hold soldiers accountable without ignoring the invisible wounds they carry? Brent Burke's story forces us to confront the harsh realities faced by many returning soldiers. It is a cautionary tale about the consequences of neglecting veteran mental health and the urgent need to provide meaningful support. His life serves as a reminder that behind every uniform is a human being, complex, vulnerable, and often deeply scarred. The tragic outcome of Brent Burke's case is a call to action. If we fail to care for those who served, we risk losing them to the cycle of trauma and violence. As you reflect on this story, remember that every soldier's battle does not end on the battlefield. It continues long after they come home. Case number 6. Hassan Akbar betrayal on the battlefield. It was supposed to be a secure camp, filled with trust, brotherhood, and a shared mission. But on a warm desert night in Kuwait, the calm was shattered, not by enemy fire, but from within the wire. One man would commit the unthinkable, murdering his fellow soldiers in cold blood. This is the story of Sergeant Hassan Akbar, a man who turned on his own, igniting one of the most chilling acts of betrayal in modern U.S. military history. The date was March 23rd, 2003. The Iraq War had just begun. American forces were staging in Kuwait, preparing for the massive ground invasion into Iraq. Camp Pennsylvania was home to the Army's 101st Airborne Division, elite troops ready to deploy at a moment's notice. Among them was Sergeant Hassan Akbar, a combat engineer with the 326th Engineer Battalion. Quiet, reserved, intelligent, but also isolated, paranoid, and deeply troubled. By many accounts, Akbar felt alienated from his peers. Some described him as socially awkward. Others recalled he had a growing resentment, particularly toward non-Muslim soldiers. As night fell, the camp settled into sleep. Soldiers rested for the brutal days ahead. But Akbar had other plans. Around 1 a.m., while most of the camp was sleeping, he crept into the tents of senior officers and threw multiple grenades inside. Seconds later, he opened fire with his M4 rifle, targeting anyone who moved. The chaos was instant. Screams, explosions, smoke, and confusion. When the dust settled, 2 officers were dead, Captain Christopher Seifert and Major Gregory Stone. 14 others were wounded, some critically. It was an ambush from within, a betrayal no one had seen coming. Akbar fled into the shadows, but was quickly captured by fellow soldiers. He had injuries on his hands from one of the grenades, but was otherwise unharmed. During the investigation, a chilling piece of evidence surfaced: his diary. In it, Akbar had written of his hatred toward fellow soldiers, fears of being killed by them, and his anger toward the U.S. military's mission in the Middle East. One entry read, "I'm going to try and kill as many of them as possible. I'll have to try to get away with it. Otherwise, I'll be caught and executed." It was clear this wasn't a breakdown. This was premeditated murder. The military wasted no time. Akbar was flown to the U.S. and charged with 2 counts of premeditated murder and 3 counts of attempted murder. His court-martial began in 2005, and the trial laid bare his motives, mindset, and the devastating impact of his actions. Prosecutors painted him as a cold-blooded killer who had turned his back on his country. The defense, however, argued that Akbar suffered from mental illness and had long felt victimized by racism and harassment within his unit. They pointed to his past. He had converted to Islam as a young man and often felt alienated in a culture he didn't fully connect with. They argued his isolation, combined with untreated psychological issues, had driven him to snap, but the jury wasn't moved. He was convicted on all charges. And in April 2005, Sergeant Hassan Akbar was sentenced to death. The military jury voted unanimously for the death penalty, citing the deliberate and calculated nature of his attack. To this day, he remains on death row at Fort Leavenworth, one of only a few soldiers to receive that sentence since the Vietnam War. His appeals have been ongoing, but no court has reversed the judgment. The ramifications of Akbar's actions rippled far beyond the courtroom. The military was forced to reevaluate internal threats and mental health screening. The attack raised uncomfortable questions. How had such deep resentment and instability gone unnoticed? How could a soldier plan to kill his own comrades in the middle of a war zone? Even within the Muslim American military community, the case sparked deep pain and frustration. Many feared backlash, profiling, and a renewed wave of suspicion toward their patriotism. Akbar's actions, they said, did not represent their faith or their service. But for the families of the dead, the case wasn't about politics or religion. It was about 2 men Captains Seifert and Major Stone, whose lives were taken not in battle, but while they slept beside their brothers in arms. Akbar's betrayal became one of the few instances in U.S. military history where a soldier directly attacked his own unit. It shattered the illusion of unity in the ranks and reminded everyone that the greatest threats can sometimes come from within. 20 years later, his name remains a stain on the uniform he once wore, a symbol of hatred, fear, and a twisted sense of justice. Not a martyr, not a soldier, but a murderer in camouflage. His fate may lie in the appeals courts, but his legacy is already written, in blood, betrayal, and the silence of a dark desert night. Case number 5. Nazar Jason Abdo, a plot stopped just in time. He was a soldier sworn to protect, but behind closed doors, he was planning to kill the very people he once trained beside. In a chilling case of domestic terror, the story of Nazar Jason Abdo is one of betrayal, extremism, and a deadly plot that almost came true. Born in 1990, Nazar Jason Abdo grew up in Texas. A convert to Islam, he enlisted in the U.S. Army in 2009, training as an infantryman. But early on, Abdo began voicing discomfort with America's wars in the Middle East. He filed for conscientious objector status in 2010, citing religious beliefs that he claimed made it impossible for him to participate in combat against other Muslims. At first, the military considered his request, but before a decision was finalized, investigators discovered something else: child pornography on his government-issued computer. In May 2011, Abdo was formally charged with possessing illicit material. He was AWOL just weeks later. But Abdo wasn't just trying to avoid trial. He was plotting something far more sinister. By July 2011, he surfaced in Killeen, Texas, the same city where Fort Hood, one of the largest military bases in the world, is located. Abdo checked into a local motel and began gathering supplies: a pistol, ammunition, shrapnel, smokeless gunpowder, and bomb-making ingredients, including clocks, wires, and nails. What was he planning? According to his own chilling confession later, he intended to bomb a local restaurant popular with soldiers, then open fire as survivors ran out. He called it a revenge attack, an act of terror in retaliation for U.S. military action in Muslim countries. It was nearly a repeat of the 2009 Fort Hood shooting, where Major Nadal Hassan killed 13 and wounded 32 others in a deadly rampage. Abdo reportedly idolized Hassan and even referenced him in his writings. But this time, the attack was stopped before it began. A gun store clerk, suspicious of Abdo's nervous behavior and unusual purchases, tipped off local police. When authorities raided his motel room on July 27, 2011, they found a bomb-making notebook with "Make a bomb in the kitchen of your mom" written across the top, a reference to Al-Qaeda's online magazine, Inspire. The evidence was overwhelming. Inside the room were weapons, explosives, and detailed plans. Abdo was arrested without incident, and when questioned, he chillingly admitted he was planning to kill as many soldiers as possible. He even smiled in court during early appearances, at one point shouting Nadal Hassan, Fort Hood 2009, as a twisted tribute. The trial that followed left no doubt about his intentions. Prosecutors revealed that Abdo had carefully planned every detail, from the timing of the attack to materials used for the bomb. His internet search history was filled with jihadist propaganda, instructions on constructing improvised explosive devices, and manifestos of lone wolf terrorists. In 2012, he was convicted on all charges, including attempted use of a weapon of mass destruction, attempted murder of federal employees, and possession of a firearm in furtherance of a violent crime. The sentence: 2 consecutive life terms plus 60 years in federal prison. In court, Abdo showed no remorse. His statements were filled with religious justifications and anger at the U.S. government, but his own family condemned his actions. His father, who lived abroad, publicly stated he was ashamed of his son. Many in the Muslim American community also distanced themselves from Abdo, saying his actions were those of a radical extremist, not a representative of their faith. Leaders across Texas spoke out, praising the fast action of the gun store employee and law enforcement for preventing what could have been one of the deadliest attacks on U.S. soil. But the case sent a wave of fear through the military community. How close had they come to another Fort Hood? What if the gun shop employee hadn't spoken up? What if the bomb had gone off during lunchtime in a packed cafe? The potential for mass casualties was staggering, and all at the hands of someone who once wore the uniform. Abdo's case is a sobering reminder that domestic terrorism doesn't always wear a foreign face. Sometimes, it grows quietly in the minds of the disillusioned, the radicalized, and the disturbed. In his twisted logic, Abdo saw himself as a warrior. In reality, he was a coward targeting unarmed men and women, seeking to cause maximum pain. Today, he sits behind bars, silenced, disgraced, and erased from the ranks he once joined. But the scars of his plot linger. Fort Hood tightened security. Military installations across the country reevaluated insider threats. And a nation, still reeling from its battles overseas, was reminded once again that sometimes the war comes. Case number 4. Robert Bale's The Kandahar Massacre. In war, horrors are expected. But sometimes, the most chilling atrocities don't come from the enemy. They come from the men we trust with our flag. The case of Staff Sergeant Robert Bales is not just one of murder. It's one of mass slaughter, shattered ethics, and a nation left stunned by a soldier who went rogue. It was a dead of night, March 11th, 2012, in Panjwai District, Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. The villagers were asleep. No alarms, no firefights, just silence. Then, like a ghost in the dark, Robert Bales, a decorated U.S. Army soldier, left his remote base at Kambalambe, armed with an M4 rifle, a 9mm handgun, and a plan. Over the next few hours, he would massacre 16 civilians, men, women, and 9 children, in what would become the deadliest war crime committed by a U.S. service member during the war in Afghanistan. But how did a seemingly loyal soldier become a killer of innocence? Bales was 38 years old at the time, a married father of 2. He had served 4 tours, 3 in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. He was known by his peers as a competent, even admired non-commissioned officer. But his life was unraveling. At home, he faced financial ruin, marital stress, and pending disciplinary action for misconduct. He was also showing signs of PTSD and possible traumatic brain injury. Despite this, he was deployed again in his last tour, where he was stationed in one of the most volatile regions of southern Afghanistan. On that fateful night, Bales reportedly drank alcohol, took sleeping pills, and left the base twice. The first time, he entered a nearby village, kicked in doors, and executed families at close range. Witnesses later described him shooting people as they begged for their lives. He then set some of the bodies on fire. He returned to base, calmly told another soldier, "I just shot some people," and then left again to repeat the carnage in another village. By the time he was done, 16 civilians were dead, 6 wounded, and entire families wiped out in their homes. When Bales returned for the second time, blood covering his clothing, he quietly surrendered. He was flown back to the U.S. within days and placed under arrest. As the news broke, outrage exploded, both in Afghanistan and around the world. Protests erupted across the country, and the U.S. military scrambled to contain the damage. Afghan President Hamid Karzai called the massacre unforgivable. The Taliban vowed revenge. U.S.-Afghan relations, already strained, nearly collapsed. Back in America, Bales' defense painted a portrait of a broken man, traumatized, overworked, and mentally unwell. His lawyers argued that the military had failed to protect him and others like him, deploying wounded minds into a battlefield with no exit. But for the Afghan people, explanations didn't matter. The names of the dead told the story. Toddlers, mothers, elderly men shot in their beds. No weapons, no combat, just slaughter, faced with overwhelming evidence, including eyewitness testimony, forensic reports, and Bales' own admission. The case never went to trial. In 2013, Robert Bales pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He now served his time in solitary confinement at United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, the same prison that holds many of the military's most notorious criminals. Years later, Bales spoke from prison, blaming his actions on rage, stress, and poor leadership. But even he admitted, "There's not a good reason in this world for why I did the horrible things I did." The military acknowledged failures in the system, allowing a soldier showing signs of mental and emotional collapse to be sent back into combat. But to many, that didn't excuse what happened. The Kandahar massacre forced the Pentagon to re-examine mental health protocols, tour lengths, and oversight in remote postings. It also fueled anti-American sentiment abroad, with some Afghans citing the massacre as justification for rejecting U.S. presence altogether. Even among fellow soldiers, Bale's name became synonymous with betrayal, not just of the army, but of the warrior's code. He didn't kill in a firefight. He hunted families in their sleep. What drove him to do it? Was a psychotic break, a moral collapse, or a system that chewed him up and spat him back out? We may never fully know. But the legacy of Robert Bales is etched into the war's darkest chapter, a man trained to protect, who instead became the monster villagers feared in the night, a soldier whose personal demons spilled into innocent blood. And in the stillness of Kandahar, the silence remains, broken only by the memories of those who never. Case number 3. Clint Lawrence, a controversial conviction and presidential pardon. War zones are chaotic, a fog of uncertainty where split-second decisions can mean life or death. But what happens when those decisions cross the line from combat into criminality? The story of First Lieutenant Clint Lawrence is one of battlefield tragedy, divided opinions, and a legal battle that reached the highest office in the land. Clint Lawrence was a young Army officer, commissioned in 2011, leading a platoon in Afghanistan's dangerous Kandahar province. His mission: to protect his soldiers and complete objectives in hostile territory. But the pressures of war, the relentless threat of insurgents, and a culture hardened by combat set the stage for a tragic outcome. On July 2nd, 2012, Lawrence's platoon was on a routine patrol near the village of Meskinai, Afghanistan. Intelligence suggested enemy fighters might be nearby, ready to ambush. Tensions were high. The soldiers were alert. According to court testimony, Lawrence observed a group of 3 Afghan men walking along a ridge overlooking their position. Believing the men posed an imminent threat and suspecting they were Taliban scouts or preparing an attack, Lawrence made a decision that would alter the course of his life. He ordered his men to open fire, killing all 3. The men were unarmed and reportedly posed no immediate threat. 2 of them were later identified as farmers. The incident sparked an investigation. The Army charged Lawrence with second-degree murder and other offenses, claiming he ordered an unlawful killing in violation of the rules of engagement. The trial that followed was fierce and highly scrutinized. Supporters of Lawrence argued that he was a brave officer in a complex battlefield environment, making tough calls under pressure. They said he was protecting his soldiers from potential ambushes and acted with the intent to save lives. Critics called it an unjustified murder of innocent civilians, a clear violation of military law and ethics, and a stain on the honor of the U.S. Army. In 2013, Lawrence was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 20 years in military prison. His rank was revoked, and he was dishonorably discharged. Behind bars, Lawrence became a symbol for a growing movement within the military and conservative circles who believed he was a scapegoat, punished unfairly for doing his duty. His case attracted widespread media attention and political lobbying. After years of legal appeals, a surprising twist arrived in 2019. Then President Donald Trump granted Lawrence a full presidential pardon. The pardon wiped away his conviction and sentence, restoring his rights and clearing his name. The pardon reignited the debate. Was Lawrence a hero who made a split-second decision to save lives, unjustly punished by an overly cautious military justice system? Or was he a soldier who crossed a moral line, whose actions led to the deaths of unarmed civilians? Lawrence himself maintained his innocence, saying the shooting was justified given the danger his platoon faced. His supporters hailed the pardon as a victory for military leadership and battlefield decision-making. But critics worried the pardon sent a dangerous message, that rules of engagement and protection for civilians could be undermined by politics and pressure. The case exposed the difficult balance soldiers face in modern warfare, how to protect themselves while respecting the laws and ethics that govern combat. It highlighted the challenges commanders face in environments where enemies blend with civilians, and mistakes can carry lifelong consequences. Lawrence's story also shed light on the military justice system itself, its complexities, controversies, and the rare power of the commander-in-chief to override courts-martial. For many, Clint Lawrence's name evokes strong feelings, either as a wronged officer or convicted killer. His conviction and subsequent pardon remain a flashpoint in discussions about accountability, command responsibility, and the harsh realities of war. Ultimately, Lawrence's case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How do we judge actions taken in the chaos of combat? Where is the line between courage and recklessness? And who holds the ultimate authority to decide justice for soldiers in war? His life story is a stark reminder that even those sworn to defend can fall victim to the complex and often tragic consequences of war. Case number 2. Eddie Ray Ralph, the murder of Chris Kyle. In the world of American military legend, few names resonate like Chris Kyle, known as the deadliest sniper in U.S. military history. His story is one of unmatched skill and valor, but also a tragic end that shocked the nation and exposed the deep wounds carried by many veterans. The man who took Kyle's life? Another soldier, haunted and broken, Eddie Ray Ralph. Chris Kyle served 4 tours in Iraq, credited with over 160 confirmed kills, a symbol of lethal precision and dedication. After leaving the military, Kyle became an author and public figure, sharing his story in the best-selling memoir American Sniper and the hit film adaptation. But despite his heroic image, Kyle's story ended in a tragic confrontation with a fellow veteran. Eddie Ray Ralph was a former Marine who served tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. But unlike Kyle, Ralph struggled deeply with PTSD, schizophrenia, and other mental health issues after his deployments. His family and friends described him as a man slipping into darkness, battling voices in his head, paranoia, and isolation. On February 2nd, 2013, Kyle and his friend Chad Littlefield took Ralph to a remote shooting range near Chalk Mountain, Texas. Their intention was to help Ralph by giving him a therapeutic outlet, a chance to reconnect through familiar military activity. But what happened next was horrifying. Minutes after arriving at the range, Ralph pulled out a handgun and shot both Kyle and Littlefield multiple times, killing them both. The brutal murders stunned the nation. How could 2 decorated veterans, trying to support a fellow soldier, end up dead by his hand? Ralph was arrested on the spot. In custody, his mental health history became central to the case. Defense attorneys argued that Ralph was not guilty by reason of insanity, claiming he was psychotic at the time of the killings and incapable of distinguishing right from wrong. The trial exposed the dark underbelly of veteran care in America, the lack of adequate mental health support, the stigma surrounding PTSD, and the dangers when broken minds go untreated. Psychiatrists for the defense describe Ralph as delusional and hearing voices commanding him to kill. The prosecution acknowledged his mental illness, but argued he was still aware of his actions and their consequences. After weeks of testimony, the jury found Eddie Ray Ralph guilty of capital murder in 2015, sentencing him to life in prison without parole. The verdict brought some closure to the families of Kyle and Littlefield, but left lingering questions about the invisible battles many veterans face after returning home. Chris Kyle's legacy remains celebrated, a testament to courage and sacrifice, but his death is a stark reminder that the scars of war are not always visible. For Eddie Ray Ralph, the battlefield never ended. His war was inside his own mind, a relentless fight he ultimately lost. The case spurred renewed calls for better mental health services and support for veterans, highlighting how critical intervention can be the difference between life and death. In the end, the tragic collision of 2 soldiers' fates, one a celebrated hero, the other a broken man, forces us to confront the real cost of war beyond the battlefield. It's a story of honor, loss, and the urgent need to care for those who have served. Case number 1. Ronald Gray, the soldier behind bars for heinous crimes. The name Ronald Gray might not be as familiar as some others on this list, but his story is one of the darkest and most disturbing cases involving a former U.S. soldier sentenced to life in prison. Gray's crime shook communities and raised deep concerns about the shadows lurking behind military service. Ronald Gray enlisted in the U.S. Army in the early 1970s. On paper, he was just another young man serving his country during a turbulent time. But behind closed doors, his actions would reveal a terrifying double life. Gray served as a military policeman stationed at various posts, including Fort Dix, New Jersey, and other locations along the East Coast. While his military career was unremarkable in many ways, His personal life was anything but. Between 1973 and 1977, Ronald Gray committed a string of brutal crimes that horrified the nation. Over the course of several years, he was responsible for the kidnapping, rape, and murder of at least 6 women, mostly young mothers, in the Philadelphia and New Jersey areas. The crimes were marked by extreme violence and chilling brutality. His victims were abducted from their homes or while going about their daily lives, only to be subjected to horrific assaults before being murdered. What made the case even more shocking was Gray's military background. Authorities were stunned to learn that a soldier, entrusted with upholding the law as a military policeman, was the man behind such unspeakable acts. His ability to evade capture for so long added to the fear gripping the communities. It wasn't until 1977 that police finally arrested Ronald Gray, after DNA evidence and witness testimony linked him to the crimes. The trial that followed was intense and widely publicized. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. Forensic proof tying Gray to multiple crime scenes, survivor testimonies, and a history of violence that painted a clear picture of guilt. Gray's defense tried to argue diminished responsibility, but the evidence was too strong. He was convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder, rape, and kidnapping. The court sentenced Ronald Gray to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never walk free again. His incarceration raised important questions about the military's role in screening and monitoring personnel. How could a man capable of such horrific violence serve as a military policeman, a position of authority and trust? Experts examining the case pointed to failures in mental health evaluations and the dangers of untreated psychological issues in the ranks. Ronald Gray's case became a grim reminder that evil can hide behind even the most honorable uniforms. It forced law enforcement agencies to rethink how they investigate and prevent crimes involving military personnel. More importantly, it highlighted the critical need for better psychological support for soldiers, especially those working in positions requiring a high degree of responsibility. Today, Ronald Gray remains imprisoned, a dark chapter in military justice history. His crimes haunt the victims' families and communities to this day, a stark warning of what can happen when monsters walk in uniform. The story of Ronald Gray reminds us that while many serve with honor and sacrifice, some betray that trust in the most horrific ways imaginable. It challenges us to remain vigilant, to demand accountability, and to ensure justice for all. War is not just fought on distant battlefields. It's fought within the hearts and minds of those who serve. These stories reveal the harsh realities behind the headlines, the moments when duty, trauma, and justice collide in ways we can barely comprehend. If these cases remind us of anything, it's that accountability and support must go hand in hand for the sake of our soldiers and the ideals they fight to uphold. Thank you for watching. If you found this video eye-opening, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth true crime and military justice stories. And let us know in the comments which case impacted you the most, or which story you want us to explore next. Together, we can keep these important conversations alive. Stay safe, and see you in the next video.